The potions classroom was filled with the usual symphony of bubbling cauldrons and muted conversation, but to Hermione, the noise felt distant, as though a veil separated her from the rest of the world. She sat at her usual station, meticulously arranging her ingredients, while Draco worked opposite her, his movements uncharacteristically careful. Weeks had passed since they had been partnered, and though tension still lingered, something unspoken had shifted between them. The biting remarks had lessened, replaced by curt exchanges that occasionally softened into actual cooperation. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was something. "Granger," Draco said, his voice cutting through her thoughts, "you're adding the crushed Bezoar too early." Hermione blinked, her hand freezing mid-motion. She frowned, glancing at the instructions. He was right. "I know that," she snapped, setting the Bezoar aside. "I was testing you." Draco smirked faintly. "Sure, you were." Hermione rolled her eyes but said nothing, her focus returning to the potion. They worked in near silence, the occasional instruction or observation passing between them. It was a strange sort of rhythm they had fallen into, one neither of them would admit to appreciating. As the potion reached its final stages, Draco leaned back in his chair, watching Hermione stir the cauldron with her usual precision. "You know," he said suddenly, "for someone who claims not to trust me, you haven't double-checked anything I've done today." Hermione glanced at him, her brow furrowing. "That's because I've been too busy fixing your mistakes." "Really?" he replied, raising an eyebrow. "Name one mistake I've made." Hermione opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated. To her annoyance, she couldn't think of any. Instead, she huffed and returned her attention to the cauldron. Draco chuckled softly, and Hermione resisted the urge to glare at him. He had a frustrating way of getting under her skin, but she couldn't deny that he had been surprisingly competent. It was unnerving. "Malfoy," she said abruptly, her tone sharper than intended. "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" he asked, his expression guarded. "This," she gestured vaguely between them. "Being decent." Draco was silent for a moment, his gaze dropping to the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "Maybe I'm tired of being the person I was." Hermione stared at him, her mind racing. She wanted to believe him, but the scars of the past ran deep, and trust was not something she gave freely. Still, there was a vulnerability in his words that was difficult to ignore. Before she could respond, Professor Snape's voice rang out. "Granger, Malfoy, your potion is adequate for now. Clean up your station." The moment was broken, and Hermione turned back to the cauldron, her cheeks flushing. Draco said nothing as they tidied up, but the air between them felt heavier, weighted with unspoken thoughts. Later that evening, Hermione sat in the library poring over her notes. The quiet hum of the room was soothing, a welcome reprieve from the chaos of her thoughts. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice Draco until he sat down across from her. "Granger," he said, sliding a book across the table. "I found this in the restricted section. Thought it might help with the next stage of the project." Hermione blinked, surprised. She picked up the book, her fingers brushing the worn leather cover. "How did you get this?" Draco smirked. "I have my ways." She frowned, flipping through the pages. It was exactly what they needed, but the idea of Draco sneaking into the restricted section for her, or for their project, left her unsettled. "Thank you," she said reluctantly. "Don't mention it," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "Seriously, don't." Hermione almost smiled despite herself. For all his flaws, Draco had an infuriating way of being endearing when he wasn't trying to be. They worked together in the library until the lamps dimmed, signalling the late hour. As they packed up their materials, Draco hesitated, his gaze lingering on Hermione. "Granger," he said quietly, "I meant what I said earlier. I want to be different. I want to be someone people can count on." Hermione looked at him, her skepticism warring with an unexpected flicker of hope. "That's not something you can prove with words, Malfoy." "I know," he replied, his voice steady, "but I'm willing to put in the work, even if it takes a lifetime." Hermione didn't know what to say. Instead, she nodded, her expression softening ever so slightly. "We'll see." As they left the library, their footsteps echoing softly in the empty corridor, Hermione found herself thinking that maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible, even for someone like Draco Malfoy. The next day, the Great Hall buzzed with its usual energy, students chatting and laughing as plates of breakfast appeared before them. The enchanted ceiling reflected a cloudy morning, the soft grey light casting long shadows across the room. Hermione sat between Harry and Ron, her attention divided between her plate and the open book propped against a jug of pumpkin juice. It was a typical morning for the trio, Hermione engrossed in her studies, Ron scarfing down his food with no regard for table manners, and Harry idly stirring his porridge, his gaze occasionally drifting toward Ginny at the far end of the table. "You're going to get syrup on your book," Ron muttered through a mouthful of toast. Hermione frowned, shifting her book a few inches away from his plate. "And you're going to choke if you keep eating like that." Harry smirked, but before he could comment, a soft, fluttering sound drew their attention. An unfamiliar, tawny owl swooped low over the table, a small, neatly wrapped package clutched in its talons. It landed delicately in front of Hermione, dropped the package and took off again without waiting for a treat. Hermione blinked, startled. "What's this?" Ron leaned closer, his mouth still full. "You've got a secret admirer," he teased, spraying crumbs across the table. "Honestly, Ron," Hermione muttered, brushing the crumbs away as she examined the package. It was wrapped in simple parchment, tied with a thin silver ribbon. There was no note, no indication of who had sent it. "Well, aren't you going to open it?" Harry asked, his curiosity piqued. Hermione hesitated, but eventually untied the ribbon, peeling back the parchment to reveal a small, ornate box. Inside were sugar quills, her favourite. She stared at them, her brows knitting together. "Who'd send you sugar quills?" Ron asked, snatching one before she could stop him. "You don't even like sweets that much." "I like these," Hermione said quietly, still frowning at the box. It didn't make sense. Sugar quills weren't exactly rare, but the thoughtfulness of the gesture threw her off. Someone knew these were her favourite and had gone out of their way to send them anonymously. Harry leaned closer, inspecting the box. "No note at all?" Hermione shook her head. "Nothing." She closed the box and set it aside, her appetite suddenly gone. The mystery gnawed at her, but she wasn't ready to share her suspicions. Not yet. Across the room, at the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy watched the scene unfold from behind his copy of the Daily Prophet. His expression remained carefully neutral, but there was a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes as he saw Hermione untie the ribbon. He had debated whether or not to send the sugar quills, wondering if the gesture would be too obvious. But seeing her reaction, confused, perhaps even a little touched, he decided it had been worth the risk. "What's got you so interested over there, Malfoy?" Blaise Zabini asked, following Draco's gaze. "Nothing," Draco replied smoothly, folding the newspaper. "Just wondering how long Weasley's arteries will hold out at the rate he's going." Blaise snorted, returning to his plate, and Draco allowed himself a small, private smirk. He wasn't sure what he hoped to achieve with the gesture. Maybe it was a way of extending an olive branch, even if Hermione would never know it was from him. Or maybe, just maybe, he wanted to remind her that not all surprise had to come with suspicion. Back at the Gryffindor table, Ron continued to munch on the sugar quill, oblivious to Hermione's deepening frown. "Who cares who sent it? Free sweets are free sweets." "That's not the point, Ron," Hermione snapped, snatching the box back. "It's odd, that's all." "It's not that odd," Harry said carefully. "Maybe someone wanted to do something nice for you." Hermione shot him a sceptical look but said nothing. She tucked the box into her bag, resolving to think about it later. For now, she had to focus on her work and try not to let her mind wander to the possibility of who might have sent the sugar quills. As the trio left the great hall, the box weighed heavier in her bag than it should have, its mystery lingering in her mind like the faint, sweet taste of sugar. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Charms classroom, casting warm, golden rays onto the desks. Hermione adjusted her grip on her wand, her focus sharp as she waited for Professor Flitwick's instructions. Charms had always been one of her favourite classes. It was orderly, precise, and rewarding when done correctly. But today, Hermione found her usual focus fraying at the edges. A certain Slytherin seated 2 rows behind her had a way of throwing her off balance lately, and she hated that he was getting under her skin. Draco Malfoy was quieter these days, less antagonistic, but his mere presence was enough to make her hyper-aware of herself. "All right, class," chirped Professor Flitwick, standing on a stack of books to better address the room. "Today we'll be tackling counter-charms for common hexes. Pair up, 1 Gryffindor with 1 Slytherin, please." A collective groan rippled through the room, and Hermione closed her eyes briefly, willing herself to stay calm. Of course they'd be paired this way. As her classmates began moving about, Hermione heard the all-too-familiar sound of someone clearing his throat behind her. She turned to find Draco standing there, his wand already in hand. "Looks like it's us, Granger," he said with a faint smirk. His tone wasn't mocking exactly, but it still carried a hint of challenge. Hermione frowned but nodded. "Fine, let's get this over with." They moved to an empty section of the room, Draco leaning casually against a desk, while Hermione stood rigid, her wand clutched tightly. Professor Flitwick's voice floated over the hum of the classroom. "Remember, the goal is not to overpower your partner, but to neutralize their hex effectively. Take turns practicing both sides of the spell." Draco raised an eyebrow at Hermione. "Ladies first?" Hermione didn't dignify his comment with a response. Instead, she pointed her wand at him, her movements sharp and precise. "Rictus Emperor!" The tickling hex shot out of her wand, hitting Draco squarely in the chest. He doubled over, laughter spilling from his lips as he stumbled backward. His legs gave out, and he fell to the ground, clutching his ribs as he laughed uncontrollably. His pale face turned pink from the effort, and Hermione couldn't help but smirk. "Finite incantatem," she said briskly, ending the spell. Draco lay there for a moment, catching his breath, his chest rising and falling as the laughter faded. He tilted his head back, looking up at her from the floor with a wry grin. "Tell me, Granger," he said quietly, his voice still a bit breathless. "Was that your way of flirting with me?" Hermione blinked, stunned by the unexpected question before a laugh burst from her lips. A real, genuine laugh that filled the space between them. She shook her head, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "You'd know if I was flirting, Malfoy," she replied, tilting her chin slightly. "I would have hexed you harder." Draco chuckled, sitting up and brushing dust off his robes. "Noted," he said, his smirk deepening. "I'll keep that in mind for next time." They returned to their exercise, but the tension between them had shifted into something lighter, almost playful. Hermione hated to admit it, but for a brief moment she had actually enjoyed their banter. The session continued, with the two taking turns hexing and countering, their dynamic surprising not only each other but their classmates as well. When Professor Flitwick called for a demonstration, Hermione and Draco stepped forward, their movements fluid as they cast and countered with precision. By the end, Even Hermione had to admit that Draco was good. Annoyingly good. As the class dispersed, Hermione found herself walking beside Draco in the corridor, their pace oddly in sync. "You're not half bad with a wand, Malfoy," she said grudgingly. He smirked. "High praise coming from you, Granger." "Don't even start," she replied, but the faint smile that tugged at her lips betrayed her amusement. For a fleeting moment, as their footsteps echoed down the stone hallway, Hermione considered that perhaps, just perhaps, Draco Malfoy wasn't entirely irredeemable. The Gryffindor table buzzed with its usual morning energy, the scent of freshly baked bread and sizzling bacon wafting through the great hall. Hermione sat amidst the chaos, her nose buried in advanced arithmancy equations, while Harry picked absently at his porridge and Ron demolished his third slice of toast. She was halfway through deciphering a tricky theorem when the air above their table shifted with a soft flutter. A sleek barn owl swooped low, its wings brushing the tips of Hermione's curls before it landed delicately in front of her. In its talons was a small parcel wrapped in parchment, tied with a thin silver ribbon. The chatter around them faltered as nearby students turned to look. Hermione blinked, momentarily caught off guard. It wasn't the first time this had happened, and she felt her cheeks flush as whispers rippled through the Gryffindor table. Ron froze mid-bite, crumbs tumbling onto his plate. "Again?" he muttered, his voice sharper than usual. "What is it this time?" Harry asked, craning his neck slightly to peer at the parcel. Hermione hesitated, her fingers brushing the delicate ribbon. She could already feel the weight of everyone's stares pressing down on her. "I don't know," she said, her tone clipped. "Let me look." Ron scowled, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Someone's got a lot of nerve sending you things like this. Who is it, Hermione?" "I don't know, Ron," she snapped, pulling the ribbon loose. She carefully unwrapped the parchment to reveal a small jar of honeyed almonds, her favourite treat. Her brows knit together as she stared at the jar, her thoughts swirling. "What's that?" Ron pressed, leaning closer. His voice was tinged with something Hermione recognised immediately. Jealousy. "Honeyed almonds? Who even knows you like those?" "Apparently someone does," Harry said lightly, though his amused smile faded when Hermione shot him a warning glare. Ron's eyes narrowed. "This is ridiculous. Whoever it is, they're just trying to get your attention. Probably some git who thinks he's being clever." "Ron!" Hermione's frustration bubbled over. "It's not a big deal. Just drop it, will you?" But Ron was already muttering under his breath, his face flushed. Hermione groaned inwardly, fighting the urge to shove the jar into her bag and pretend it didn't exist. She was tired of the speculation, the whispers, and Ron's barely concealed envy. It was sweet, in its own way, but it was also exhausting. "What's that?" Harry asked, gesturing toward a folded piece of parchment tucked beneath the ribbon. Hermione picked it up, unfolding it carefully. The note was written on thick, cream-coloured paper in elegant, slanted handwriting. "A mind as sharp as yours deserves something sweet to keep it running. A friend." Hermione frowned at the note, the cryptic words gnawing at her curiosity. "It doesn't say who it's from," she murmured. Ron snatched the note from her hands before she could stop him. His eyes scanned it quickly and his scowl deepened. "A friend? Really? That's not suspicious at all." "Ron, give it back," Hermione snapped, snatching the note from his grip and tucking it into her bag alongside the jar. "It's none of your business." "It is when people start sending you." Ron gestured wildly toward her bag, struggling to find the words. "Whatever that is. They're just trying to get to you, Hermione. You shouldn't encourage it." "Encourage it?" Hermione stared at him, incredulous. "You think I asked for this?" Harry cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the tension building between them. "Maybe it's just someone who admires you," he offered diplomatically. It doesn't have to mean anything sinister." Ron snorted. "Right. Because anonymous gifts are always perfectly innocent." "Honestly, Ron," Hermione snapped, her patience fraying, "if you're so bothered by it, maybe you should focus on your own life instead of sticking your nose in mine." Ron opened his mouth to retort, but the look on Hermione's face stopped him short. Instead, he huffed and returned to his toast, his movements brusque. Hermione sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. The mystery of the parcel had already been enough to occupy her thoughts. Ron's jealousy was an unwelcome complication. Later, as Hermione made her way out of the great hall, the morning's events replayed in her mind. She pulled the note from her bag, her eyes lingering on the slanted handwriting. Whoever was behind these gestures was paying attention. Too much attention, perhaps. The honeyed almonds, the sugar quills, these weren't random guesses. She pressed her lips together, slipping the note back into her bag. Whoever it was, they clearly wanted her to notice, but why wouldn't they reveal themselves? Did they think anonymity would make her trust them more, or less? Hermione sighed. Speculating wouldn't get her anywhere. She'd just have to wait. Whoever they were playing a deliberate game, and she would have to be patient enough to see what their next move would be. For now, there was nothing more she could do. Across the hall, at the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy allowed himself the faintest hint of a smirk as he watched the scene unfold. He had been careful to keep his expression neutral, but the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes was unmistakable. The honeyed almonds had been a calculated choice, subtle, thoughtful, and just enough to pique her curiosity without giving himself away. "Are you even listening to me, Malfoy?" Blaise Zabini's voice cut through his thoughts. "Of course," Draco replied smoothly, though he hadn't caught a word of what Blaise had said. His attention remained on the Gryffindor table, where Hermione was now resolutely ignoring Ron, her expression a mix of irritation and intrigue. Draco leaned back in his seat, his mind already turning to the next move. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The late autumn air carried a sharp chill as Hermione stepped out of the castle, the thin golden rays of the morning sun doing little to warm the frosted grounds. She tightened her scarf around her neck, her breath clouding in front of her as she made her way to the greenhouses for herbology. Her thoughts, however, were far from the lesson ahead. The small jar of honeyed almonds nestled in her bag weighed heavier than it should have, a constant reminder of the strange parcel and cryptic note that had consumed her mind. Ron walked beside her, his footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves, his mood as turbulent as the clouds overhead. Harry was on her other side, glancing between them uneasily. The trio's usual harmony felt fractured, disrupted not only by the anonymous gesture, but by Ron's growing frustration. "I still don't understand why you're not more bothered by this," Ron muttered, breaking the uncomfortable silence. His tone was sharper than it had been during breakfast. "Someone's sending you things like this, Hermione. They're practically stalking you." Hermione sighed, her patience thinning. "It's not stalking, Ron. It's a parcel, a thoughtful one at that." "Thoughtful?" Ron scoffed, his expression darkening. "It's creepy, Hermione, and you don't even know who sent it. What if it's some nutter trying to mess with you?" "Ron," Harry warned, his voice calm but firm, "leave it alone, mate." "I can't leave it alone," Ron shot back, his eyes flashing with indignation. "Look at her. She's carrying that jar around like it's a prized possession. If it's not some nutter, then who? Malfoy." Hermione stopped abruptly, spinning on her heel to face Ron. Her cheeks were flushed, whether from the cold or from anger, she wasn't sure. "Why does it matter to you so much? Do you think I asked for this? That I wanted someone to send me honeyed almonds out of the blue?" Ron opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off, her voice rising. "Maybe it's just someone who admires me. Is that so hard for you to believe?" The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Ron's face reddened, but he didn't reply. Instead, he looked away, his shoulders stiffening. Harry cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. Hermione exhaled deeply, her breath visible in the cool air. She regretted snapping, but she didn't apologize. She was too tired, too frustrated to deal with Ron's jealousy. When they arrived at the greenhouses, Professor Sprout's cheerful greeting did little to lighten the mood. Hermione quickly moved to her usual station, putting as much distance as possible between herself and Ron. She unpacked her tools with deliberate precision, willing herself to focus on the lesson ahead. The venomous tentacula sat in front of her, its dark green vines writhing like snakes. Hermione donned her gloves, her movements brisk and efficient, but her mind remained elsewhere. The note's cryptic message played on a loop. A mind as sharp as yours deserves something sweet to keep it running. Whoever the sender was, they had to know her well. But why remain anonymous? What was the point? As Hermione reached for her trowel, a shadow fell across her workstation. She looked up to see Draco Malfoy standing at the next station, his own gloves already in place. He wasn't looking at her directly, but the smug tilt of his mouth told her he knew she'd noticed him. "What do you want, Malfoy?" Hermione asked, her tone sharper than intended. Draco smirked, his grey eyes flicking to hers. "Relax, Granger," he drawled, his voice laced with amusement. "I'm just here to work, though I couldn't help but notice you look distracted today. Something on your mind?" Hermione stiffened, her grip tightening on the trowel. "None of your business," she snapped. Draco raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Touchy, aren't we? Must be something interesting to get under your skin like that." Hermione ignored him, focusing on the writhing tentacula in front of her. She manoeuvred the vines into a larger pot, her movements more forceful than necessary. She refused to rise to the bait. Draco had an infuriating way of knowing exactly how to needle her, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "Whatever it is," Draco continued, his tone lighter now, "I'm sure it'll sort itself out. Things have a way of revealing themselves eventually. Sometimes you just have to wait." Hermione froze, her heart skipping a beat. Was he talking about the parcel? Did he know something? She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, but his expression remained maddeningly unreadable. Professor Sprout's voice broke through her thoughts, instructing the class to begin tidying up their workstations. Hermione packed up her tools quickly, eager to escape the greenhouse and the lingering tension between herself and Draco. But as she stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Draco leaning against the greenhouse doorframe, his arms crossed. "What now, Malfoy?" she asked, exasperated. He shrugged, his expression calm but inscrutable. "Just wondering how long you plan to pretend you don't care about that little mystery of yours." Hermione's stomach twisted, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, come on, Granger," he said, his voice low and amused. "You're practically radiating curiosity. Whoever's been sending you those little presents, you're dying to know who it is, aren't you?" She opened her mouth to deny it, but the words caught in her throat. The truth was, he wasn't wrong, and that infuriated her even more. "Not that it matters," Draco continued, his tone casual but his gaze sharp. "I'm sure they'll reveal themselves eventually. Maybe sooner than you think." Hermione stared at him, her heart pounding. There was something in his voice, a subtle challenge that made her wonder. Could it be him? But no, that didn't make sense. Draco Malfoy didn't do anonymous gestures. He didn't do kind. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice colder than she intended. Draco smirked, pushing off the doorframe. "Who says I do?" And with that he turned and walked away, his footsteps crunching softly against the fallen leaves. Hermione remained rooted in place, gripping the strap of her bag tightly. The jar of honeyed almonds and the note felt heavier than ever, their presence a constant reminder of the growing mystery. Whoever was behind the gestures, one thing was clear. They weren't done yet. And whether she liked it or not, Hermione knew she would have to wait for their next move. The morning sunlight filtered through the enchanted ceiling of the great hall, bathing the rows of tables in golden light. Hermione sat at her usual spot between Harry and Ron, her movements brisk and distracted as she buttered a slice of toast. She had spent the night tossing and turning, her mind replaying Draco's cryptic words and the note from the mysterious parcel. The lack of answers had begun to needle her more than she cared to admit. "Hermione, you're going to wear a hole in the table," Harry said, gesturing at the way her knife scraped furiously against the toast. "I'm fine," Hermione snapped, setting the knife down with more force than necessary. Harry exchanged a glance with Ron, who was chewing on a mouthful of sausage, clearly thinking better of getting involved. Hermione sighed, pressing her palm to her forehead. She wasn't fine, not even close. Between Ron's incessant jealousy and the growing enigma of the parcels, her patience was rapidly fraying. Just as she tried to focus on her book, the flutter of wings drew her attention. She groaned inwardly as a sleek owl swooped low over the table, a small parcel in its talons. It landed directly in front of her, drawing a wave of whispers and curious glances from the nearby students. "Not again," Ron muttered, his voice dripping with irritation. "This is getting ridiculous." Hermione felt her cheeks heat under the scrutiny. Without looking up, she untied the parcel, her fingers shaking slightly as she worked. She could feel Ron leaning closer, his frustration radiating off him in waves. "Hermione, you can't keep ignoring this," he hissed. "Whoever it is, they're not going to stop." "Would you just leave it alone, Ron?" Hermione snapped, her voice low but sharp enough to make Harry wince. She pulled back the parchment wrapping to reveal an elegant quill with an intricately engraved handle. It was immediately recognisable as a charmed writing quill, the kind she had admired months ago during a trip to Diagon Alley. Ron's face darkened, and he crossed his arms tightly. "This is mental. That quill must have cost a fortune. Who goes around sending expensive gifts like that without saying who they are? Maybe someone who doesn't want you prying into their business," Hermione shot back, tucking the quill and the accompanying note into her bag before Ron could snatch it. The irritation bubbling inside her was dangerously close to boiling over. Couldn't they just let her figure this out without constantly questioning her? Harry cleared his throat. "It's thoughtful, though. Whoever's sending these things, well, it's clear they care about you." Hermione didn't respond. She didn't trust her voice to come out evenly, not with the mix of frustration, curiosity, and unease swirling in her chest. She hated being the centre of attention, and even more, she hated feeling like she was dancing to someone else's tune. The day dragged on, the weight of the mystery pressing heavier on her with each passing hour. By the time evening arrived, Hermione found herself in the library again, seeking solace in the quiet rows of books. She had intended to work on her arithmancy essay, but her focus was fractured. The note from the latest parcel tugged at her thoughts, daring her to take it out and read it again. With a sigh, she reached into her bag and unfolded the parchment, smoothing it against the desk. The elegant handwriting was the same as before, for the one who wields knowledge so gracefully. "Let this quill keep your thoughts flowing. A friend." Hermione's brow furrowed as she read the words again, frustration clawing at her. A friend? What kind of friend didn't reveal themselves? The note wasn't just thoughtful. It was deliberate, almost too deliberate. Whoever was sending these gifts knew her tastes, her habits, her preferences, and that realization was as flattering as it was unsettling. She leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning, and then, like a shadow creeping across her thoughts, an idea began to form. Could it be Draco? The thought startled her, but as it took root, it began to make an unsettling kind of sense. His behaviour over the past few weeks had been different, less abrasive, more observant. And then there were his words in the greenhouse. "Whoever's been sending you those little presents. You're dying to know who it is, aren't you?" Had he been hinting at something? Or was it just another way to get under her skin? Hermione frowned, shaking her head. No, it couldn't be. Draco Malfoy didn't do kind gestures, let alone anonymous ones. But then again, this wasn't the same Draco she had clashed with for years. He was changing. She could see it, even if she didn't want to admit it. And the thought of him being behind the parcels stirred a confusing mix of emotions she wasn't ready to untangle. Granger. Hermione jumped, shoving the note into her bag as Draco appeared out of nowhere, taking the seat across from her. His smirk was firmly in place, but there was something different about it, something quieter, less sharp. "You really need to work on that, you know," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Anyone could sneak up on you." Hermione glared at him, her heart still racing. "What do you want, Malfoy?" Draco tilted his head, his grey eyes flicking to her bag for the briefest of moments before returning to hers. "Relax. I just came to enjoy the silence, though you don't seem very relaxed." "I was," Hermione said pointedly, "until you showed up." His smirk widened, but he didn't take the bait. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You've been awfully jumpy lately, Granger. Something on your mind?" Hermione bristled, her hands curling into fists under the table. Was he toying with her, or was this his way of hinting at something? She couldn't tell, and that infuriated her even more. "Nothing that concerns you," she said tightly. Draco chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. "If you say so." His tone was light, but the look in his eyes suggested he knew far more than he let on. As he stood to leave, he cast her one last glance, his smirk softening into something unreadable. "See you around, Granger. Try not to overthink it." Hermione watched him walk away, her mind racing. If he was behind the parcels, he was doing an excellent job of keeping her guessing. And if he wasn't, well, she didn't know what to think anymore. She sighed, pulling out her arithmancy notes and forcing herself to focus. But as the minutes ticked by, the mystery lingered at the edge of her thoughts, refusing to let her go. The Gryffindor dormitory was quiet, the soft sound of breathing from the other girls filling the space. Moonlight streamed in through the window, painting silvery patterns across the floor. Hermione lay in bed, staring at the canopy above her, her quilt bunched up and tangled from hours of restless tossing and turning. Her mind refused to quiet itself. Every time she closed her eyes, the same questions churned in her head. What was the motive behind the parcels? What did the sender want from her? And, more disturbingly, why did it feel so personal? Hermione sighed, turning onto her side as her thoughts refused to relent. It was clear that whoever was behind the gifts cared about her, deeply even. They paid attention to her, to the small details that most people overlooked. Her favourite treats, a quill she had admired but never mentioned aloud. These weren't random gestures. They were thoughtful, deliberate, and designed to mean something to her. She pulled her knees to her chest, her brow furrowing as a fresh wave of unease swept over her. But why remain anonymous? If the sender cared so much, why not reveal themselves? It wasn't as though she was inaccessible. It wasn't as though she was unapproachable, was it? Hermione groaned softly, burying her face in her pillow, The anonymity of the gestures felt both flattering and frustrating. It kept her tethered to a mystery she couldn't solve, spinning her mind in endless circles as she tried to piece it all together. Her thoughts drifted to Draco, and she froze. The idea had crept into her mind earlier, unbidden and unwelcome, but the more she tried to dismiss it, the more it persisted. His words in the library, his smug demeanour. He knew something. She was sure of it. He had dropped too many hints, all too conveniently timed to the arrival of the parcels. Hermione sat up abruptly, her heart pounding in her chest. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, and the picture they created unsettled her. Draco had been different lately. She had noticed it in the way he spoke, the way he carried himself. He wasn't as cruel, as biting, as he had been in the past. Instead, there was a quietness to him, a subtle restraint that felt almost deliberate. And then there were the moments when he had watched her, his gaze lingering just a little too long, his words laced with double meanings she couldn't quite decipher. And yet, it wasn't just his recent behaviour that nagged at her. It was the gestures themselves. They felt Draco-like, in a way that was hard to explain. The refined handwriting, the understated but thoughtful gifts, the air of mystery. It all pointed to him. Who else could it be? But why? That was the question that kept her stomach in knots. If Draco was behind the parcels, what was his motive? Was it some elaborate game, another way to toy with her? Or was it something more? Something she wasn't ready to acknowledge. Hermione hugged her knees to her chest, her pulse racing as the realization settled over her. It's him. It has to be him. The thought was as infuriating as it was undeniable. Draco Malfoy, the boy who had spent years tormenting her and her friends, was the one sending these thoughtful, almost tender gestures. And the worst part? She couldn't figure out why. What did he want from her? Her mind ran in circles, trying to untangle the knot of emotions that had formed in her chest. Annoyance, intrigue, confusion. They blended together until she couldn't tell one from the other. She wanted answers, but none of them seemed within reach. Not tonight, at least. As the hours ticked by, Hermione remained wide awake, her thoughts chasing themselves in an endless loop. The dormitory was silent, the other girls lost in peaceful slumber, but Hermione felt miles away from rest. She knew she wouldn't sleep that night. Not when the pieces of the puzzle were so tantalizingly close, yet so maddeningly incomplete. Draco Malfoy. The name echoed in her mind, a riddle she couldn't yet solve. But one thing was certain. She wouldn't stop until she uncovered the truth. The Gryffindor dormitory was bathed in the pale grey light of early morning, the castle still cloaked in the quiet of dawn. Hermione lay rigid in her bed, staring at the canopy above her with red-rimmed eyes. Sleep hadn't come, not even close. Her mind had spun through the night, chasing answers she couldn't catch, leaving her nerves raw and her patience in tatters. She sighed heavily, pushing herself upright. There was no point in staying in bed any longer. Her roommate's soft breathing filled the room as she moved quietly, gathering her uniform and slipping into the bathroom to get ready. The mirror reflected her tired face, her hair wild and uncooperative. She made a half-hearted attempt to tame it, but the unruly curls refused to behave, much like her thoughts. Defeated, she tied it back loosely and headed down to the common room. The chill of the early morning air hit her as she stepped into the corridor, and she pulled her robes tighter around herself. Her body felt heavy, her movements sluggish as she trudged toward the great hall. The idea of facing the day felt impossible, but tea, strong, scalding hot tea, was her only hope of powering through. The hum of chatter greeted her as she entered the great hall, students already filling the long tables. She made a beeline for her usual spot at the Gryffindor table, sinking into her seat with a weariness that felt bone deep. She reached for the teapot without a word, pouring herself a cup and gripping it like a lifeline. The warmth seeped into her hands, but it did little to soothe the storm brewing inside her. "Rough night?" Harry's gentle voice broke through the haze. He leaned closer, concern etched into his face. Hermione took a sip of her tea, willing it to give her strength. "You could say that," she muttered. Her tone clipped. Harry exchanged a glance with Ron, who was already halfway through his plate of bacon and eggs. "Maybe give her a break today," Harry said under his breath, his tone edged with warning. Ron, however, either didn't hear or chose to ignore him. "If it's about those parcels again, I've got a few things to say." As if on cue, the telltale flutter of wings descended from above. Hermione's heart sank as she watched yet another owl swoop down, a neatly wrapped parcel clutched in its talons. It landed right in front of her, drawing a fresh wave of whispers from nearby students. She closed her eyes for a moment, gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. "Oh, for Merlin's sake," she muttered through gritted teeth. Her hand shot out, grabbing the package with more force than necessary. This time she didn't even hesitate. She muttered a wandless spell, and the parcel vanished in an instant, sent to the sanctuary of her room. The whispers grew louder, but Hermione was too far gone to care. Ron, however, wasn't finished. "This is getting out of hand," he said, his voice rising. "Whoever's doing this clearly wants something from you." "Ron!" Hermione snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the growing noise. Heads turned as her frustration boiled over. "Do you think I asked for this? Do you think I enjoy being the centre of everyone's attention? For once in your life, just leave it alone." The table fell silent. Ron opened his mouth as if to argue, but the look on Hermione's face stopped him short. Harry reached out as though to calm her, but she was already standing, grabbing her bag with a force that nearly toppled her cup of tea. Without another word, Hermione stormed out of the great hall, her footsteps echoing loudly against the stone walls. Her chest heaved as she strode through the corridors, her anger burning away the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. She didn't care where she was going, she just needed to be away. By the time Hermione reached the classroom for their next lesson, her anger had simmered into a dull ache. She pushed open the door, her bag slung over her shoulder, and froze when she saw Draco Malfoy leaning casually against the desk at the front of the room. His trademark smirk played at the corners of his mouth, and his grey eyes lit up the moment he saw her. "Granger," he began, his tone infuriatingly smug, but she cut him off before he could say another word. "Don't," she said sharply, her finger raised in warning. "Not a word. Not today." Draco raised an eyebrow, his smirk faltering slightly as he studied her. For a moment he seemed tempted to push her further, but something in her expression must have made him think better of it. With a shrug, he leaned back against the desk, falling silent. Hermione moved to the farthest corner of the room and dropped into a seat, her bag hitting the floor with a dull thud. She didn't look at him again, choosing instead to pull out her notes and pretend to study, but the words blurred before her eyes, her exhaustion finally catching up to her. Every muscle in her body felt heavy, and her mind begged for even a moment of peace. The classroom began to fill with other students, their chatter barely registering in Hermione's ears. The professor's voice droned on, but the lesson felt distant, like a sound muffled through a thick wall. Her eyelids grew heavier, her head dipping forward as she fought against the pull of sleep. She didn't realize she had lost the battle until her head rested against her folded arms, her breathing soft and even. The world around her faded into silence, her thoughts mercifully slipping away as exhaustion claimed her at last. The classroom was empty when Draco arrived. the early morning light slicing through the high windows and spilling unevenly across the rows of desks. The air was sharp with the lingering chill of autumn mornings, and Draco leaned against the desk at the front of the room, arms crossed as he surveyed the quiet space. It was a momentary calm, a respite from the constant hum of Hogwarts life. But even in the silence, his thoughts were anything but still. His mind kept circling back to her, Granger. It wasn't intentional, this fixation on her, but it had become impossible to ignore. The way she had stormed out of the Great Hall earlier, her frustration bursting forth for all to see, stayed with him. He hadn't expected the parcels to affect her like this, hadn't anticipated the pressure they'd bring. Draco sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He'd spent so much time trying to figure out how to reach her, how to show her that he wasn't the same person anymore. But perhaps his efforts had been too much, or too subtle depending on how she saw them. She wasn't stupid. She'd figure it out eventually. The question was, how long would it take? The thought unsettled him, more than he cared to admit. He wanted her to know it was him, to understand that he wasn't playing games, that his gestures weren't some ploy. But at the same time, he wasn't sure he was ready for what would happen when she did. Would she lash out, furious with him for stepping into her life in ways she hadn't asked for? Or would she look at him differently, see him for who he was trying to become? The uncertainty gnawed at him. Draco shook his head, trying to dispel the thoughts. He wasn't sure how he'd manage it yet, but he needed to tread carefully. Granger had a way of seeing through facades, of peeling back layers until she reached the truth. If she figured him out before he was ready, there'd be no hiding from her sharp gaze. The sound of hurried footsteps interrupted his musings, and moments later Hermione stepped into the room. The tension she carried was palpable, her shoulders stiff, and her expression taut with exhaustion. Even from across the room, Draco could see the faint shadows beneath her eyes, a stark reminder of just how much pressure she was under. "Granger," he began, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. He didn't expect her to tell him what was wrong, but he couldn't help wanting to ask. Yet, before he could say anything else, she cut him off. "Don't!" she snapped, her finger pointed at him like a warning. Her voice was sharp, her frustration crackling in the air between them. "Not a word. Not today." Draco raised an eyebrow, the sting of her dismissal sharper than he expected. He considered pressing her further, provoking her as he might have done in the past, but he stopped himself. She wasn't in the mood, and he didn't want to make things worse. With a shrug, he leaned back against the desk, watching her cross the room and sink heavily into the seat farthest from him. She dropped her bag onto the floor with a thud, her movement slow and deliberate. Her usual fire seemed dimmed, and Draco couldn't help but feel responsible. He hadn't meant to push her to this point, hadn't expected his gestures to leave her unravelling. As the classroom began to fill with students, Draco retreated to his own seat near the back, his gaze flicking to Hermione repeatedly. Her quill sat untouched on her desk, her parchment blank, and her head dipped forward as though the weight of her thoughts was too much to bear. He watched as her breathing slowed, her exhaustion taking over until she finally succumbed to sleep. Draco stared, his mind suddenly blank. He'd never seen her like this, unguarded, vulnerable, her features softened by sleep. It stirred something deep inside him, something he couldn't quite name. There was an instinct to shield her, to smooth away the worry lines etched into her brow. The sunlight streaming through the windows caught his attention, its harsh glare falling across her face. Draco frowned, his hand twitching as he fought the urge to act. It was a ridiculous thought, really. Conjuring a blanket, placing it over her shoulders. But the idea refused to leave him. He wasn't sure what he was doing, wasn't sure why he cared so much, but the pull was undeniable. The chill in the room made her shift, her arms tightening around herself as though seeking warmth. Without thinking, Draco murmured a wandless, warming charm, his magic spreading gently through the space. He watched as the tension in her body eased, her features softening as she sighed in her sleep. The sound, so small, so quiet, made something inside him ache. It was the smallest indication that she was finally finding some semblance of peace, even if only for a moment. Draco leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight as he watched her. He didn't want her to figure it out. Not yet. But as he took in the delicate line of her jaw, the stray strand of hair that had fallen loose over her face, he couldn't help wondering how much longer she would remain oblivious. She was smart, sharper than most, and he knew she'd piece it together eventually. When she did, everything would change. For better or worse, he had no idea. But one thing was certain. He wouldn't stop trying. Whatever it took, he'd keep finding ways to reach her, even if she never understood why. Hermione woke slowly, the sound of chairs scraping and footsteps fading from the classroom, pulling her from her heavy sleep. She blinked groggily, lifting her head from her folded arms, her hair spilling across her face as she struggled to orient herself. Her limbs felt stiff, her mouth dry and her cheeks flushed as the realization set in. She had fallen asleep. In class. A wave of embarrassment washed over her as she sat upright, her movements hurried. The room was empty now, save for a few stray parchments left behind on desks. The professor and her classmates had long since gone, leaving her alone to stew in her mortification. Hermione's eyes scanned the desk, reaching for her quill, but her fingers froze as they brushed the edge of a neatly stacked set of notes. Her brow furrowed, and she flipped through the papers, her pulse quickening as her eyes roved over the familiar handwriting, sharp, elegant, and deliberate. Draco Malfoy. Her stomach twisted as the realization hit her with startling clarity. The handwriting matched perfectly. Every stroke, every flourish was the same as the notes that had accompanied the anonymous parcels. For weeks, she had been puzzling over the sender's identity, wondering who could be paying such close attention to her preferences and habits. Now there was no mistaking it. It was him. Hermione's grip tightened on the notes as her mind raced. Why would Malfoy do this? What could he possibly want from her? The parcels had been thoughtful, unnervingly so, and these notes were no different. They felt intentional, meaningful, almost kind. But that didn't make sense. Draco Malfoy didn't do kind. Her chest heaved as conflicting emotions surged through her. Frustration, disbelief, and something she refused to name swirled together, making it impossible to focus. She shoved the papers into her bag and stood abruptly, her exhaustion compounding the whirlwind inside her head. She couldn't deal with this right now. Not here, not like this. The walls of the classroom felt stifling, the air heavy and suffocating. Hermione needed space. Room to breathe, to think, to process the revelation that was clawing at her thoughts. Slinging her bag over her shoulder, she made her way out of the classroom, her footsteps echoing faintly against the stone floors. Instead of retreating to the library or the Gryffindor common room, she chose to head outside. The autumn air felt crisp and clean as she stepped into the courtyard, the sun struggling to break through the clouds above. She inhaled deeply, letting the chill fill her lungs and push back the tension that had gripped her since waking. The courtyard was quiet, save for the faint rustle of leaves carried by the wind. Hermione sank onto a stone bench, the cool surface grounding her as she rested her bag beside her. For a moment she let her head fall back, closing her eyes and surrendering to the peaceful stillness. But even as the breeze soothed her nerves, The notes in her bag weighed heavily on her mind. She couldn't deny it anymore. Draco was the one behind the parcels. The realization had settled uncomfortably in her chest, refusing to be ignored. She could see it now, the threads connecting his actions, the parcels, the thoughtful gestures, the way his gaze lingered on her more often than it should. Hermione shook her head, trying to dispel the thought. She didn't want to acknowledge it, not yet. Not when she was already stretched thin. Whatever his motives were, she couldn't afford to let them consume her. She needed clarity, time to sort through her emotions before she could confront the truth. She reached into her bag, pulling out a book, one that had nothing to do with her coursework. Hermione opened it to a random page, letting herself get lost in the familiar comfort of words. For now, she would focus on the world within those pages, even if it was just for a little while. The grounds of Hogwarts stretched endlessly before Hermione, the sprawling lawns bathed in the soft glow of midday sunlight. She had spent the better part of an hour sitting on the cold stone bench in the courtyard, the open air offering a reprieve from the suffocating thoughts swirling in her mind. The copy of Draco's notes in her bag weighed heavily against her side, a constant reminder of the truth she now couldn't unsee. Draco Malfoy had been sending her those parcels. The handwriting was unmistakable. It wasn't a conclusion she had wanted to reach, not after everything they had been through, not after years of animosity and cold disdain. But there it was, staring her in the face. She thought back to the sugar quills, the honeyed almonds, the charmed quill, all thoughtful gifts, all tailored to her preferences in ways she hadn't realized anyone had noticed. The strangest part was how personal it felt. The Draco she had known wouldn't bother with subtlety, wouldn't waste time with gestures like these. He was always loud in his insults, calculated in his actions, and yet this, the gifts, the notes, was quiet, unobtrusive, deliberate. It made no sense. And still Hermione couldn't deny the nagging feeling that perhaps she had underestimated him. She stood up abruptly, her hands gripping the strap of her bag. She didn't have the patience to sit and stew over this anymore. There was no denying the facts, but she could choose not to acknowledge them. Not today. Her heart wasn't ready for whatever confrontation awaited her when the time came to address it. For now, she would focus on regaining her balance, on finding her footing amidst the chaos that had taken over her mind. Hermione began walking toward the edge of the lake, the crisp autumn breeze pushing strands of hair across her face. The water sparkled faintly in the sunlight, its surface calm and steady, unlike her thoughts. She let herself wander, her footsteps crunching against the gravel path, the rhythmic sound soothing in its simplicity. What does he want? The question nagged at her, echoing in the back of her mind. She didn't believe Draco was cruel enough to send the parcels simply to unnerve her. There had been something genuine in the gifts, in the way he had slipped his notes onto her desk without a word. And yet his motives were impossible to discern. What was he trying to prove? And why her? Hermione sighed, rubbing her temples as her mind spiraled yet again. She hated feeling this unsure, hated not knowing the answers. But for all her frustration, there was something about the situation that unsettled her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The gestures were thoughtful, kind even, and if it had been anyone but Draco Malfoy behind them, she might have felt flattered. The sound of footsteps approaching from behind pulled Hermione from her thoughts. She turned her head slightly, catching sight of a familiar figure moving across the path. Her heart sank as she recognized him. Draco. Hermione's grip tightened on the strap of her bag as she watched him approach. His gait slow but deliberate. There was no smirk on his face, no trace of the arrogance she had come to expect. Instead, his expression was unreadable, his gaze focused solely on her. She stiffened instinctively, her exhaustion blending with frustration as he stopped a few paces away. "Granger," he said quietly, his voice devoid of its usual sharpness. Hermione met his gaze, her jaw tightening. "What do you want, Malfoy?" Her words came out harsher than she intended, but she didn't care. After everything, she wasn't ready for whatever conversation he had come to initiate. Draco hesitated, his grey eyes flicking toward the lake before returning to hers. "You seemed—" He paused, his brow furrowing slightly as he searched for the right word. "I don't know. Off. I thought I'd check if you were all right." Hermione stared at him, her thoughts grinding to a halt. Draco Malfoy. Checking on her? The absurdity of it almost made her laugh, but the sincerity in his tone made her falter. Her grip on her bag slackened as she struggled to formulate a response. "I don't need you checking on me," she said finally, her voice colder than she felt. "I'm fine." Draco tilted his head, his expression calm but not indifferent. "Right," he said simply, as though he didn't entirely believe her. "Well, if you're fine, then I'll leave you to it." Hermione expected him to leave, to retreat back into his usual aloofness, but he stayed rooted to the spot for a moment longer. His gaze flicked briefly to her bag, the faintest flicker of something, curiosity maybe, passing over his face. Hermione instinctively shifted her posture, hiding the notes from view. When Draco finally turned and walked away, Hermione felt a strange sense of relief mixed with something heavier, an unease she couldn't shake. As much as she tried to ignore it, her mind clung to the sincerity in his voice, the softness in his gaze. It felt real, and that terrified her more than anything else. Hermione shook her head, refocusing her thoughts as she continued down the path. She couldn't deal with this now. Not with him, not with herself. She needed clarity, distance, time to sort through the tangled mess of emotions he had stirred up. For now, she would keep walking, keep breathing, keep pretending that she was still in control. But deep down, she knew the moment would come when she could no longer avoid the truth, and when it did, everything would change. The cold wind whipped around Hermione as she wandered the grounds, her hands shoved deep into her robes to ward off the chill. Her thoughts swirled like the leaves caught in the breeze, untamed and chaotic. She couldn't seem to stop the endless cycle of questions spiralling in her mind. Draco Malfoy, the sender of the parcels, the one who had carefully placed his notes on her desk, had somehow managed to shatter the image she had painted of him over the years. And now she wasn't sure how to piece it back together. Hermione found herself near the edge of the lake again, its surface rippling gently in the breeze. She sank onto a bench, her bag resting beside her, its contents a reminder of the boy who had been consuming her thoughts far too much lately. She felt like she was losing her grip on the familiar. The steady logic that had always guided her was slipping away, replaced by uncertainty. And then the memory surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. Potions class weeks ago. She had been working methodically at her station, focused on perfecting their assigned potion, when Draco had spoken. His voice had been quieter than usual, devoid of its usual sarcasm. He'd suggested, no, proposed, a truce between them. Perhaps we could try this whole thing differently. A truce, Granger. The words echoed in her mind, and with them came the image of his face, serious, calm, as if he had meant every syllable. At the time, Hermione had been too caught off guard to respond with anything more than guarded suspicion. She had thought it was a trick, another one of his games. After all, Draco Malfoy didn't just offer truces. He was calculated, strategic, and everything he did had a purpose. But now, that moment hung differently in her mind. It wasn't just the truce, it was the tone of his voice, the way he had looked at her, as if he was genuinely trying to extend an olive branch. and maybe he had been. Maybe she had underestimated the depth of his intent, just as she had underestimated the meaning behind the parcels. Hermione hugged her knees to her chest, her eyes fixed on the rippling water. If the truce had been his way of reaching out, it wasn't unreasonable to think the parcels were an extension of that. Thoughtful, personal gifts meant to build a bridge between them, one she hadn't realized he was trying to construct. Her thoughts shifted to his behavior in the classroom earlier that day. The way he had watched her, how he hadn't pushed when she'd snapped at him. His silence had been steady, not tense, as if he'd accepted her frustration without needing to counter it. It was another piece of the puzzle, one that only deepened the ache in her chest. Hermione pressed her palms into her temples, trying to steady the swirl in her mind. She hated that she was dissecting his motives like this, hated that her emotions were tangled up with her usual logic. Draco Malfoy had been her rival for years. He wasn't supposed to make her feel this way, curious, unsettled, almost hopeful. The faint sound of laughter reached her from across the grounds, cutting through her thoughts like a sharp blade. Hermione looked up, watching as a group of students crossed the bridge, their carefree energy a stark contrast to her current mood. She envied them, their simplicity, the lack of complexity weighing on their minds. For her, everything was shifting, and she wasn't sure where it was heading. Hermione glanced at her bag, the weight of the notes inside calling to her. She knew she would have to address the truth eventually, and would have to confront Draco about what he had been doing, but today wasn't that day. She needed time to think, to breathe, to figure out where this fragile thread between them might lead. For now, she would let the fresh air clear her head as best it could. She stood, brushing off her robes and heading toward the edge of the forbidden forest, her footsteps steady, but her thoughts far from settled. Friday stretched before Hermione like a tightly wound cord, the weight of her resolve pressing firmly on her shoulders. The castle hummed with its usual rhythms, but to her, every sound felt distant, muted by the singular decision she had made. She would confront Draco today. No more circling around it, no more allowing him to disrupt her thoughts without providing answers. By the time her final class ended, the late afternoon sun painted the castle in warm tones of amber and gold. Students poured out of classrooms, their laughter and footsteps filling the halls. Hermione lingered near the staircase leading to the courtyard, her eyes scanning the passing crowd. She wasn't ready to act yet. Not until the flow of students thinned and the space outside offered the privacy she needed. She spotted Draco through the archway, standing near the fountain. His posture was uncharacteristically casual, his hands tucked into his pockets as he gazed absently at the water. He seemed lost in thought, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. For a moment Hermione hesitated, her steps faltering as she watched him. "This is ridiculous," she told herself firmly. Whatever vulnerability he had shown in recent weeks didn't change the years of animosity between them. If he was truly trying to turn a new page, then she deserved to know why. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders and stepped into the courtyard, her boots clicking softly against the stone path. "Malfoy," she called, her voice cutting through the quiet. He turned at the sound of her voice, his grey eyes sharpening as they met hers. There was a flicker of curiosity in his gaze, and he tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into the faintest hint of a smirk. Granger," he said, his tone smooth and deliberate. "What brings you here?" Hermione stopped a few feet away, her arms crossing firmly over her chest. She glanced around the courtyard, ensuring no one else was nearby, before fixing him with a resolute stare. "We need to talk." Draco's smirk softened into something subtler, his gaze narrowing slightly as he studied her. "Do we?" he asked, amusement lacing his words. "Yes," she said sharply. "I'm tired of whatever game you think you're playing. The parcels, the notes, the truce you mentioned in potions. What is it you're trying to accomplish? What do you want?" Draco's amusement faltered, his expression growing more serious. He stepped closer, his movement slow and deliberate, and Hermione felt her chest tighten as he closed the distance. "What if I told you I don't have any motives?" Hermione blinked, caught off guard. "What's that supposed to mean?" "What if I just want to be friends with you?" he said simply, his voice devoid of its usual edge. There was no mockery, no teasing, just a quiet sincerity that made her stomach twist uncomfortably. She stared at him, her mind scrambling to process his words. "Why?" she asked, her voice softer now but no less guarded. "Why would you want to be friends with me, Malfoy?" Draco hesitated, his gaze flicking briefly to the fountain before returning to hers. He exhaled slowly, his hands slipping from his pockets as he spoke. "Because I don't believe the rubbish my family does. I don't want to be that person, Granger. I don't want to carry on their hatred, their ignorance." Hermione's breath hitched slightly as his words sank in, but she pressed on, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "And the gifts? Why the parcels, Malfoy? Why not just say whatever it is you wanted to say?" Draco glanced away for a moment, his expression distant before meeting her gaze again. Because words don't mean much on their own. They're easy to say and just as easy to dismiss. I thought maybe actions would speak louder, that maybe you'd see that I'm trying, that I'm serious. Hermione's fingers curled tightly around her arms as she regarded him, searching his face for any hint of deception. But all she saw was quiet resolve. She hated how much her emotions felt tangled in this moment, how a part of her wanted to push him away and another quieter part wanted to believe him. "You can't expect everything to change with a few kind gestures," she said finally, her voice steady but guarded. "If you're serious about this, about changing, then you'll need to earn my trust. And that won't happen overnight. You'll have to prove it through your actions, show me that you mean it." Draco regarded her in silence for a moment, his grey eyes unwavering. Then he inclined his head, his expression steady. "I understand. And I will, if you'll let me." Hermione exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest easing slightly, though the unease in her mind remained. She studied him for a moment longer, then took a step back, her arms dropping to her sides. "We'll see," she said quietly. "You've got a long way to go, Malfoy." His lips quirked upward in a faint smile. "Fair enough." Without waiting for a response, Hermione turned and walked away, her thoughts spinning wildly as her footsteps echoed across the courtyard. She didn't know what to make of Draco Malfoy's sudden shift, but for now she wasn't ready to dismiss him entirely. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. The cold stone of the castle walls felt grounding beneath Hermione's fingers as she made her way back inside. The chill of the courtyard still lingered in her robes, but it was nothing compared to the storm of thoughts swirling inside her. Draco Malfoy's words echoed endlessly in her mind, replaying like a refrain she couldn't shut off. "What if I just want to be friends with you?" For years those words would have been laughable, absurd even. The Draco Malfoy she knew, sharp-tongued, arrogant and unapologetically cruel, was the last person who would ever seek out friendship with a Muggle-born, let alone with her. And yet she had seen no mockery in his expression, no trace of insincerity in his voice. The vulnerability in his tone had been startling, disarming even. For the first time, Hermione found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about him. Pausing by one of the tall windows overlooking the grounds, she glanced back toward the fountain where Draco still stood. He hadn't moved since she left, his silhouette bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon. He looked almost small, in a way she couldn't quite place. The tension in her chest only grew as she turned away, her steps quickening as she headed toward the library. The familiar stillness of the library greeted her like an old friend, its towering shelves and rows of neatly arranged books offering a comfort she desperately needed. Hermione made her way to a secluded corner near the back, the one she always retreated to when the noise of the world became too much. Dropping her bag onto the floor with a soft thud, she sank into an armchair, her head falling back against the worn leather. Her gaze drifted up to the ceiling, tracing the intricate beams of wood that crisscrossed above her. For a moment she simply sat there, letting the library's quiet settle over her like a blanket. But no matter how hard she tried to steady her thoughts, Draco's voice kept intruding, pulling her back to the confrontation in the courtyard. "I don't believe the rubbish my family does. I don't want to be that person." Hermione exhaled sharply, sitting forward and rubbing her temples. She wanted to believe him truly, but it wasn't that simple. Trust wasn't something that could be given freely, not after everything that had happened between them. And yet, there was no denying the shift she had seen in him. The parcels, the notes, his willingness to admit he was wrong. Each gesture chipped away at the wall she had built around her perception of him. It was maddening. Her fingers brushed against the strap of her bag, and before she could stop herself, she pulled out the folded parchment. Draco's notes lay neatly on her lap, the precise strokes of his handwriting sharp against the smooth paper. She unfolded them carefully, her eyes scanning the lines of text. Every word was meticulous, written with a care that felt almost foreign coming from him, because words don't mean much on their own. The memory of his explanation surfaced, unbidden. "I thought maybe actions would speak louder, that maybe you'd see that I'm trying." Hermione's fingers tightened around the edges of the parchment as she let out a slow breath. Actions did speak louder than words, but actions could also be manipulative, calculated. She had learned that lesson the hard way over the years. She wanted to believe that Draco's gestures were genuine, that his words weren't just another ploy to unsettle her. But trusting him, truly trusting him, was a leap she wasn't ready to take. Not yet. Sliding the notes back into her bag, Hermione leaned back in her chair, her arms crossing over her chest. She needed clarity, distance, something to make sense of the tangled emotions weighing on her. Draco's sudden shift was unsettling, but it wasn't the only thing gnawing at her. The part that scared her most was the realization that she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that people could change, even someone like him, but could she allow herself that vulnerability? The sound of faint murmurs pulled her attention, and she glanced toward a group of students settling at a nearby table. Their laughter was soft, their voices low but cheerful, and for a moment Hermione envied their simplicity. They weren't grappling with impossible questions or navigating the complexities of morality and forgiveness. Their lives felt lighter, freer. Hermione shook her head, refocusing her thoughts. She was no stranger to difficult questions. She had faced impossible odds before, stood her ground against forces far darker than anything Draco Malfoy could throw at her. And yet this felt different, personal, intimate even. It wasn't just about him proving himself. It was about her allowing herself to see him differently, to let go of the image she had held on to for so long. Pulling her knees to her chest, Hermione rested her chin atop them and stared at the rows of books lining the shelves. The library had always been a place of answers, a sanctuary where she could untangle her thoughts and find a path forward. But today the books felt silent, their wisdom out of reach. One step at a time. That's what she told herself, one step at a time, and maybe, just maybe, she'd find the clarity she was looking for. The following morning, Hermione sat at the Gryffindor table in the Great Hall, barely listening to Ron and Harry's conversation, as they speculated about Slytherin's chances in the upcoming Quidditch match. Her toast lay untouched on her plate, her tea growing tepid as she absently stirred it. Despite her best efforts, her mind kept drifting to the courtyard and the conversation that had unravelled so much of what she thought she knew. "I don't believe the rubbish my family does. I don't want to be that person." Draco's words had been raw, deliberate, and disarming. They echoed in her mind louder than the clatter of silverware and the hum of conversation around her. She stole a quick glance toward the Slytherin table, where Draco sat with his usual group. He looked perfectly at ease, his expression impassive as he listened to Pansy Parkinson talk animatedly beside him. Hermione quickly looked away before he could notice her. "You're awfully quiet this morning, Hermione," Harry said, nudging her arm lightly. "Everything okay?" "I'm fine," she replied automatically, reaching for her tea in an effort to appear composed. "Just tired." "You've been saying that a lot," Harry said, his concern unmistakable. "You sure you're not overdoing it with all the studying?" She offered him a weak smile. "I promise I'm fine. It's just one of those mornings." Before Harry could press further, Ron cut in with a joke about the Hufflepuff keeper's unfortunate habit of wobbling mid-air, and the conversation shifted. Hermione exhaled quietly, grateful for the distraction. She wasn't ready to talk about Draco, not with them, not yet. This was something she needed to figure out on her own, without their well-meaning but inevitably judgmental interference. After breakfast, she excused herself under the guise of needing to review her arithmancy notes in the library. Ron had only rolled his eyes, muttering something about her being too dedicated, but Harry gave her a thoughtful look that lingered as she left. Hermione shook it off, quickening her pace as she headed toward her usual refuge. The library was blessedly quiet, its towering shelves and dim, filtered light creating a sanctuary of stillness. Hermione slipped into her favourite corner, the one hidden behind rows of books that shielded her from prying eyes. She laid out her materials with practised precision, intending to distract herself with equations and theories, but her focus splintered almost immediately. She rubbed her temples as the beginnings of a dull ache formed behind her eyes. The swirling thoughts of yesterday's encounter refused to settle, and the tension gripping her chest only made it worse. Draco's words, his actions, his determination to prove himself, it all weighed on her, demanding answers she wasn't ready to give. "You're going to make it worse if you keep doing that." Hermione froze, her hand dropping from her temple as she looked up sharply. Draco was standing at the edge of her table, his arms loosely folded, and his expression bordering on something that might have been amused. Or was it concern? "What?" she asked, narrowing her eyes at him. He gestured vaguely toward her head. "Rubbing your temples like that. You've got a headache, don't you?" Hermione blinked, caught off guard by the observation. How would you know that?" Draco shrugged, pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down with infuriating nonchalance. "Lucky guess. You've got that look, like you're trying to think your way out of something and it's not going your way." Her cheeks flushed faintly, more from irritation than embarrassment. "What do you want, Malfoy?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "Believe it or not," Draco said, leaning back in his chair, "I actually came here to check on you." She raised an eyebrow, skepticism written all over her face. "Check on me? Since when do you care?" Draco tilted his head, his gaze steady. "Since yesterday, apparently." Hermione folded her arms, fixing him with a pointed look. "I think we said everything that needed to be said yesterday." "Did we?" Draco countered, his tone calm but firm, "because it seemed to me like there might be more to discuss." Hermione sighed, her fingers brushing the edge of her parchment. "And what exactly do you want to discuss, Malfoy? What's left to say?" Draco hesitated for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I just want to know if you've given any more thought to what I said, about giving me a chance to prove myself." She stared at him, searching his face for any trace of insincerity, but the Draco sitting before her now seemed devoid of his usual arrogance. If anything, he looked almost hopeful. It was unsettling. "This isn't something that can be decided in one conversation," she said carefully. "If you're serious about earning my trust, then you'll need to prove it. Through your actions, not your words." "I intend to," Draco said simply, his gaze unwavering. Hermione studied him for a long moment before letting out a quiet sigh. "Then I suppose we'll see." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Draco's lips, one that, to Hermione's surprise, seemed more genuine than smug. He stood slowly, inclining his head toward her in a way that felt oddly respectful. "Fair enough, Granger. I'll let you get back to your thinking." And with that, he walked away, leaving her alone once more. Hermione watched him go, her thoughts as tangled as ever but tinged with a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Whatever Draco Malfoy was trying to prove, she decided she would let him try. But she wouldn't make it easy. The great hall buzzed with its usual dinner-time energy, the sounds of laughter, clinking silverware and low murmurs blending together into a comforting hum. Hermione sat between Harry and Ron, her plate half empty as her mind wandered. She pretended to listen to Ron's enthusiastic recounting of Gryffindor's last Quidditch match, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the courtyard yesterday, and the parchment now resting in her pocket. Her fingers brushed against it absent-mindedly as she glanced at the Slytherin table, her movements careful not to draw attention. Draco was there, as expected, casually leaning back in his seat, seemingly engaged in conversation with Blaise Zabini. For someone who had sent her a cryptic note across the great hall, he looked entirely unbothered. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she quickly looked away, not wanting him to catch her staring. Just as she took another sip of tea, a second folded parchment materialized in front of her, its sudden appearance making her jump slightly. Her eyes widened in surprise, and she quickly lowered her tea, glancing around to see if anyone else had noticed. Harry and Ron, thankfully, were still too immersed in their Quidditch debate to pay her any attention. Hermione stared at the note, her pulse quickening as suspicion and curiosity warred within her. She glanced toward the Slytherin table again, unable to stop herself. Sure enough, Draco's eyes were on her. This time his expression held a faint trace of amusement, and when their gazes met, he tilted his head ever so slightly, encouraging her to open the parchment. He followed the subtle gesture with a wink, causing Hermione's irritation to bubble up alongside her intrigue. With deliberate movements, she unfolded the note beneath the table, angling it discreetly to avoid prying eyes. The handwriting was sharp and unmistakable, the words short and to the point. "I'll see you there." Hermione frowned, the meaning settling over her like a weighted puzzle piece. She looked up again, her brow furrowed as she sent Draco a puzzled look. There? He couldn't mean. Draco's response was almost imperceptible, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips as he met her gaze across the room. His expression held no malice, no sarcasm, just an air of certainty that unsettled her. When she gave him a slight, hesitant nod, he inclined his head in acknowledgement before turning back to his table, resuming his conversation as though nothing had happened. She folded the note and slipped it back into her pocket, her thoughts racing. Draco had asked her earlier if she was going to Hogsmeade, and now he had made it clear that he expected to see her there. Hermione wasn't sure what unsettled her more, the fact that he was assuming she would go, or the fact that she hadn't outright dismissed the idea. "Something wrong, Hermione?" Harry's voice startled her, and she turned quickly. her heart skipping as she faced him. "No," she said, perhaps too quickly. "Nothing at all, just thinking about everything I need to do tomorrow." Harry raised an eyebrow, but didn't press her further, returning to his plate. Ron, oblivious as ever, was now elbow-deep in an argument about broomstick speeds, leaving Hermione with a small pocket of silence to collect herself. As she mechanically picked at her food, one thought rose above the rest. Tomorrow she would see Draco Malfoy in Hogsmeade, and whatever happened next, she would be ready. After dinner, the walk back to the Gryffindor common room was uneventful. The chatter of students around her was a pleasant hum, but Hermione didn't fully register it. Her mind remained preoccupied, the folded parchment in her robe pocket a weight she couldn't quite ignore. Whatever tomorrow brought in Hogsmeade, she would be ready, but tonight the questions swirling inside her refused to rest. When she arrived in the common room, Harry and Ron headed straight to their usual spot by the fire. Ron immediately began a heated debate with Seamus about the efficacy of their respective broomstick brands, while Harry laughed quietly, shaking his head. Hermione excused herself, claiming a need to review her notes, and escaped to the solitude of her dormitory. She had barely set her bag down when a soft tapping drew her attention. Turning toward the window, Hermione saw a tawny owl perched on the sill, a familiar cream-coloured envelope tied neatly to its leg. Her heart softened as she opened the window, letting the chill night air sweep into the room. The owl hooted softly, extending its leg as Hermione untied the letter. "From Mum and Dad," she murmured, brushing her fingers lightly over the envelope's edges before sitting on her bed. The owl fluttered to the nearby nightstand and waited, clearly anticipating a reply. Breaking the wax seal, Hermione unfolded the parchment, her parents' neat handwriting filling the page. A small smile tugged at her lips as she began to read. "Dearest Hermione, we hope this letter finds you well. It feels far too long since we've heard from you, though we know you must be busy. We miss you terribly, but are so proud of everything you're accomplishing. You're the brightest light in our lives. How is school? Is there anything you need? Don't hesitate to let us know. We'll send you whatever might help. Speaking of sending things, we've been asked to travel with the Potion Society for the next few weeks. They're organising a series of events across Europe to promote safer brewing techniques, and it seems we can offer some assistance. Anonymously, of course. Imagine that. Bringing Muggle expertise to support the wizarding community. Your father and I are always thinking of you. Never forget how much you're loved. With all our love, Mum and Dad." Hermione folded the letter carefully, holding it against her chest for a moment. Her parents always had a way of making her feel grounded, no matter how chaotic life at Hogwarts became. Their warmth and steadfast support were constant, even when their paths diverged so vastly from the world she now inhabited. As she prepared a clean sheet of parchment to write her reply, Hermione's quill hovered over the page for a moment. A knot of hesitation tightened in her chest. Could she tell them about Draco? About his apparent attempts at redemption? Her parents had always been honest with her, even when it hurt. It was one of the reasons she felt comfortable telling them everything. Everything except, perhaps, the one secret she kept from the rest of the wizarding world. She took a steadying breath, letting her thoughts organise themselves as the words began to flow. "Dear Mum and Dad, thank you for your lovely letter. I needed it more than I realised. School has been hectic, as always, but I'm managing just fine. No need to send anything, though I appreciate the offer. And congratulations on being involved with the Potion Society. I know you'll make a difference. There's something I want to ask you about. There's someone here, Draco Malfoy, who's been acting differently. He's been trying to prove that he isn't who he used to be, but you can imagine how hard it is for me to believe him. He's done terrible things, but he says he wants to change, that he doesn't believe in the hatred his family stands for. I don't know what to make of it, and I'd love your advice. Should I trust someone like that? All my love, Hermione. Hermione set the quill down, reading over the letter with a critical eye, before folding it and sealing it in an envelope. She tied it securely to the owl's leg, stroking its feathers lightly as it gave a soft hoot and flew off into the night. For a moment she sat in the silence of the dormitory, staring out at the moonlit grounds. The weight of her family's legacy hung around her shoulders, blending with the uncertainty of her present. She knew her parents would write back with their unwavering wisdom, but for now she would have to navigate this path on her own. With a sigh, she returned to her desk, the faintest hint of resolve flickering in her chest. Whatever tomorrow brought, whether it was answers from Draco or more questions, she would face it with the same determination that had carried her this far. The tawny owl departed with Hermione's reply clutched securely in its talons, vanishing into the dark expanse of the night sky. Hermione remained by the window for a moment, the cool air brushing her face as her thoughts lingered on the contents of the letter she had sent. The words she had written to her parents, asking for their advice on Draco, expressing her gratitude, felt both comforting and bittersweet. But there were truths she hadn't put into words, truths that only existed in the quiet corners of her mind. She closed the window and sank onto her bed, the soft creak of the mattress grounding her. For years she had carried the weight of her family's decision, a decision made out of necessity, out of survival. The name Granger was something they had chosen together, a way to distance themselves from a world that had caused so much pain during the First Wizarding War. Her parents had found solace in the Muggle world, building a quiet life as dentists, far removed from the chaos and cruelty of pure-blood society. It had been a choice she understood, even admired. They wanted to protect her, to offer her a future free from the expectations and prejudices tied to their true surname. Hector Dagworth Granger, her ancestor, was a name etched into wizarding history, known as the founder of the most extraordinary society of potioneers. His legacy was undeniable, his contributions celebrated in textbooks across the magical world. But that legacy had become a burden, one her parents had no desire to pass on. They had told her everything as she grew up, never hiding the truth about their decision or the family history that loomed behind them. And when she received her letter to Hogwarts, it had been Hermione's choice to use the shortened Granger. It was a simple name, unassuming, free from the weight of expectations. Yet, as much as she had agreed with the decision at the time, the years had revealed how complicated it truly was. Sometimes she felt like she was living two lives, the one her friends knew and the one she kept hidden. They didn't know about her connection to Dagworth Granger, or the pure-blood traditions she had been taught despite her parents' efforts to shield her. It was a secret she had kept close, a lie told to protect them all. As hard as it was to conceal the truth, Hermione knew why it had to be this way. The wizarding world was fraught with dangers, and her family's safety mattered far more than her desire to be honest. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all pressed down on her. She thought of Hector's name in the pages of her potions textbook, remembered the feeling of seeing it for the first time, and knowing no one around her would make the connection. It was strange, almost surreal, to sit quietly in her classes while the achievements of her ancestor were discussed in passing. No one suspected. No one knew. And while it gave her a measure of safety, it also left her feeling isolated, as though she were severed from a part of herself. Hermione sighed, running her fingers along the edge of her blanket. Perhaps one day she wouldn't have to hide it. Perhaps there would come a time when the world was safe enough for her to embrace every part of her identity without fear. But for now she would continue the path she had chosen. For her family, for her friends, for herself. Then, turning toward her desk, Hermione reached for her quill, her mind already drifting to the next day. Whatever tomorrow brought, whether it was answers from Draco or new questions, she would face it with the determination that had always carried her through. And perhaps, just perhaps, she might start finding a way to reconcile the two lives she led. Hermione woke with the faint glow of morning sunlight streaming through the dormitory windows. Stretching lazily, she sat up and glanced around the room. It was still early, the kind of peaceful hush that came before the bustle of the day. She relished the calm, knowing it wouldn't last once the rest of the castle woke. Crossing to the mirror on her dresser, Hermione scrutinized her reflection. Her wild curls were their usual unruly mess, framing her face in a way that felt chaotic and unmanageable. For a moment she toyed with the idea of leaving them as they were, but something about the day ahead stirred the urge for a change. With a steady hand, she reached for her wand and cast a series of careful charms, trimming her hair to just below her shoulders and softening the curls into loose, controlled waves. As a final touch, she slid a simple silver hair clip into place, tucking the strands neatly away from her face. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it made her feel lighter, more composed. After dressing in a pair of mum jeans, a striped tee and her trusty Converse sneakers, Hermione expanded her bag with a charm and tucked a hoodie inside, just in case the weather turned chilly. She brushed her teeth, grabbed her wand, and took one last look in the mirror. She looked refreshed, confident. By the time she made her way to the common room, Harry and Ron were already by the fire. Ron was rummaging through his bag, muttering about forgotten items, while Harry looked up at the sound of her footsteps. His gaze lingered for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly before a warm smile tugged at his lips. "Did you do something different with your hair?" Harry asked, tilting his head. Hermione hesitated, her fingers instinctively brushing the silver clip. "I trimmed it a little," she admitted, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "It was getting in the way." Harry's smile widened. "It looks nice. Suits you." Hermione blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. "Oh, thank you, Harry." "Yeah, looks all right," Ron added absent-mindedly, still digging through his bag. Hermione stifled a laugh. Trust Ron to give a half-hearted compliment while hunting for his missing scarf. "Are you ready to go?" Ron asked, finally straightening up with an exasperated sigh. Hermione shook her head, her smile fading slightly. "Actually, I've got a few things to take care of today. You two go ahead without me." Ron frowned. "What things?" "Just errands," Hermione said simply, her tone firm but kind. "I'll meet you later if I can." Harry studied her with his usual perceptiveness, but instead of pushing, he nodded. "All right, just let us know if you need anything." Hermione felt a wave of gratitude as she watched them leave, Ron grumbling about how it wasn't the same without her, and Harry quietly keeping an eye on him. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder, took a steadying breath, and stepped out into the corridor, her steps purposeful as she made her way to her destination. The journey to Diagon Alley felt brisk and surreal. The familiar sights of the cobbled street brought a sense of comfort, though Hermione's nerves prickled with the weight of what lay ahead. She reached Gringotts quickly, the imposing marble structure gleaming in the crisp morning light. Its grandeur always left her with a mix of awe and unease. She had just stepped onto the marble steps when a firm shoulder brushed against her. Startled, she staggered slightly, her bag slipping from her shoulder. She looked up, ready to apologize, only to come face to face with Draco Malfoy. "Granger," he said, his tone even, though his brow arched slightly as if amused. "Malfoy," she replied, brushing off her sleeve and reclaiming her bag. You really ought to watch where you're going." Draco's lips quirked into a faint smirk. "Funny. I was about to say the same thing." She huffed, eyeing him suspiciously. "What are you doing here?" "Running errands," Draco said casually, glancing toward the bank's entrance. "And you?" Hermione stiffened, her tone turning cautious. "The same. Not that it's any of your business." Draco fell into step beside her, his smirk never wavering. "Well, in that case, mind if I tag along?" "Yes, actually, I do mind," Hermione shot back, quickening her pace in an attempt to shake him. But Draco was undeterred, matching her stride easily. "Come now, Granger," he drawled. "We can't keep bumping into each other like this without it meaning something. Fate, perhaps." Hermione groaned, stopping in her tracks to glare at him. "Malfoy, if you don't stop pestering me, I'm going to hex you into next week." Draco raised his hands in mock surrender, his smirk widening. All right. How about a deal? I'll stop pestering you if you let me accompany you." Hermione's eyes narrowed, her frustration boiling over. "Fine," she said sharply, crossing her arms. "But if I agree to this, you have to stop talking and listen." Draco tilted his head, feigning innocence. "Listen to what?" "To me," Hermione snapped. "If you're serious about whatever this is, trying to prove you've changed or whatever, you won't tell a soul about what you hear or see. Not one word, Malfoy, do you understand?" Draco's smirk softened into something closer to a genuine smile. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Understood, Granger. My lips are sealed." Hermione searched his face for any sign of deception, but his gaze was steady. After a moment's hesitation, she turned on her heel, her steps firm as she headed toward the entrance of Gringotts. Draco followed silently, for once keeping his word. As the great marble doors loomed before her, Hermione steeled herself. Today was about reclaiming a part of her legacy, but now, with Draco in tow, it felt like a test of her patience as well. One thing was certain. Whatever lay ahead, she wouldn't face it alone.